Rain had already been falling for hours when Detective Mara Leland stepped into the narrow evidence room, the one tucked behind a locked metal door at the end of the sheriff's hallway. The building hummed faintly, the way older structures do in weather like this, when the wind slides through every crack in the siding. She carried no umbrella, only a damp jacket and the look of someone who had not slept well in days. The corridor behind her felt too bright, too active, too alive for the task she had returned to finish. She paused in front of the shelf marked with a fading label, a smudge of blue marker barely clinging to the cardboard. The box waiting for her had been there for more than 3 decades, its corners softened by time, its lid bowed slightly from the weight of files and objects that had waited longer than anyone expected. She slid the box toward her, the slow scrape echoing in the small room. The sound felt heavier than it should have, as if the years sealed inside were shifting with the movement. She lifted the lid. Cold air from the room slipped across the old paper, carrying the faint smell of dust, metal, and something else, something like rainwater trapped in fabric long after the storm had passed. The case file sat on top, the edges curled, the ink fading. And beneath it, pressed inside a sealed plastic envelope, lay the small object that had anchored every nightmare, every rumor, every unanswered question in this town: a motel key tag. Faded yellow plastic. The number 12 stamped imperfectly on one side. She stared at it for a long moment. So many people had touched this box over the years. Investigators who retired or transferred, volunteers who eventually let their hope cool into silence, families who stopped calling when the years no longer made sense. But no one had been able to lift anything useful from the worn surface of that key, not then. Not with what forensic science could offer in 1987. Now, though, the technology existed. The kind that could retrieve the smallest trace of skin cells lingering in the grooves of old plastic. The kind that could turn a ghost into a name. Mara let out a slow breath. The room around her seemed to shrink, the air tightening, as if the story inside the box was beginning to wake. She placed her hand on the table and leaned closer to the evidence bag. Even through the plastic, she could see the scratches on the lower ridge, where a thumb may have pressed, intentional or not. The rain outside flared against the window, tapping in a steady rhythm, almost expectant. She lifted the bag gently, angling it toward the overhead light. The yellow plastic caught the reflection, dull and worn, like something that had been handled far too many times by far too many people. This little tag had sat in mud at the edge of the Alder River. It had traveled with detectives in patrol cars. It had sat on the corner of desks while people argued over timelines and suspects. It had been placed in this same box, untouched for years, waiting for the moment when someone would see it differently. Today was that moment. She reached for the submission form and began writing, her handwriting quick, deliberate, almost urgent. Request for advanced touch DNA analysis, she wrote. Priority review. She signed her name with a swift stroke. The pen trembled slightly in her hand. When she sealed the form with the evidence bag, she hesitated. Something about the weight of it felt strange. It was so light, almost insubstantial, yet everything rested on this object. The rain outside softened to a hush, a brief quiet, the kind that comes when storms shift direction. It made the air feel charged, as if the next chapter of the town's history was gathering just outside the window. She walked to the evidence transfer vault, her footsteps slow but certain. This wasn't just another assignment. It wasn't a box to clear out before storage renovation. This was the thread that had held the entire case together long after most people forgot the names attached to it. When she placed the sealed bag onto the steel tray inside the vault, the finality of the motion settled over her. There was no turning back now. Whatever story the key held, whatever truth had been buried beneath years of routine and familiarity, was about to rise. She stepped back, letting the door of the vault close with a soft click. The hallway behind her was silent when she returned, the kind of silence that feels like held breath. In a few weeks, maybe sooner, a lab technician would call. They would talk about degraded samples and sequencing yields and partial profiles. They would mention a possible genealogical hit. They would speak in cautious optimism, the language of science attempting not to overpromise. But deep down, Mara already felt it. Something had shifted. Something had turned. The storm outside broke again, rain hammering the windows and sheets. The hallway lights flickered for a moment, then steadied. She closed her eyes, letting the sound fill the silence. 36 years of waiting. 36 years of unanswered questions. 36 years of families living in the long shadow of something they couldn't name. She whispered to the empty hallway, "This is where it begins." The rain rose in a sudden gust, slanting against the glass as though urging her forward. To understand how this began, we go back to 1987. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. Morning light in Raven's Wake rarely arrived clean. It usually drifted in as a soft gray, filtered through the low clouds that hung over the Alder River like a permanent veil. On most days, that was the light Lena Marlowe woke to. Her alarm clock didn't always need to ring. The distant rumble of early trucks heading toward the mill traveled through the thin apartment walls with familiar regularity. She would sit up slowly, brush back her hair, and let her eyes adjust to the muted glow that marked the beginning of another long day. Her apartment was small but tidy, the kind of space that revealed a quiet sense of responsibility rather than comfort. A second-hand coffee maker occupied the counter, next to a stack of mismatched cups she and her younger sister Emily had collected over the years. Above the sink hung a faded calendar with handwritten reminders rent due, Emily's shift changes, the occasional optimistic note about saving for a used car. On the far wall was a corkboard pinned with a few snapshots. Emily's high school photo, a Polaroid of them at the fair 3 summers ago, and a picture of Lena on a trail by the river, her smile wide and unguarded. She kept her favorite small item next to the door, a spare motel key from the Alder Motor Lodge, one she found on the ground years ago when she worked a temporary cleaning job there. The owner let her keep it since the tag was already cracked. It became a quiet habit for Lena to tap the key, lightly against her palm whenever she was anxious or thinking through a decision. She had once joked that the key belonged to a room that didn't exist anymore, a room locked forever in a memory she never quite named. Emily teased her about it, but Lena never put it away. The key hung from a tiny hook beside their winter coats, a splash of yellow against the dull beige wall. By late morning, she was usually at the Pinnacone Diner, tying her apron behind her waist. She worked the midday shifts more often than not, knowing the tips were better and the crowd calmer. The diner smelled of brewed coffee, butter on the grill, and rain-soaked clothes steaming near the heater. Regulars called her by name. Truckers passing through often commented on her steady patience, the way she remembered their orders even months later. She didn't speak much, but people tended to talk to her anyway. She listened well, giving small smiles or nods that made others feel heard. Emily would sometimes drop by after school, sitting at the counter and tracing shapes into the condensation on her glass of lemonade. Lena always saved a slice of pie for her, usually apple, warming it just long enough for the cinnamon scent to fill the space between them. Their conversations were simple: school, groceries, which bills were due, how long they had left before the landlord raised rent again. But beneath those daily concerns lay an unspoken tenderness. They had learned to rely on each other early, after their father passed and their mother drifted in and out of town, leaving long stretches of uncertainty behind. Lena's co-workers admired her ability to stay calm even when the diner grew crowded. She never snapped, never raised her voice, never joined in the gossip that floated between tables and found its way into the kitchen. If she had dreams, bigger ones, she rarely voiced them. Once, on a quiet afternoon between customers, she mentioned wanting to visit the coast, to stand on the cliffs south of Aberdeen and watch the waves crash against the rocks. She had read once that the ocean could make a person feel new again, like time momentarily loosened its grip. She described it almost shyly, as if the desire were too fragile to speak aloud. In her free time she walked. Not far, never too late. Just enough to let the damp forest air settle her nerves after a long shift. She followed the river path behind the mill, stepping over roots and stones without hurrying. She liked the sound of water moving, steady and unchanging, even when everything else felt uncertain. She collected small objects, sometimes smooth stones, bits of colored glass softened by the river, a rusted bottle cap with faded lettering. She kept them all in a jar beneath her knitstand, a little collection of things that had survived the elements. The day before she disappeared began like any other, though she rose earlier than usual. The rain had already started, tapping lightly against the window in a way that made the morning feel colder than it was. She brewed coffee for both herself and Emily, knowing her sister would be rushing to school and wouldn't remind herself to eat. Emily laughed sleepily when she saw the mug waiting on the table. "You always know," she said. Lena shrugged, half smiling. It was simply what she did. Before leaving for work, she paused by the door, touching the motel key as she always did. It was a brief gesture, almost unconscious, as though tapping the key meant tapping into something steady. The plastic felt cool beneath her fingertips. She slipped her jacket on, grabbed her bag, and stepped outside into the rain. At the diner, the day moved slowly. The usual lunchtime rush never fully materialized. Trucks passed by without stopping. Regulars came and went with tired smiles. Lena refilled cups, wiped counters, and checked the clock more than once, though she didn't seem impatient, just thoughtful. She looked out through the rain-streaked window often, watching as the mist clung to the lamps above the highway. The world outside appeared muted, softened, as though the town were holding its breath. That evening, she stayed a little later than usual. A co-worker had called in sick, so Lena volunteered to take the last hour. She didn't complain. The extra tips would help. As the diner emptied and the lights dimmed slightly, she stood behind the counter, wiping the last of the glasses with a clean towel. The radio behind her played soft music, indistinct but familiar. She caught her reflection in the window, tired but composed. Her final phone call came just before closing. Emily had been worried about the weather and asked if Lena needed a ride. Lena laughed softly and said she would walk a bit until the rain lightened. The diner wasn't far from home, and she knew the route well, even in the dim light of the street lamps flickering through drizzle. She promised she'd be back soon, told Emily to lock the door, and ended the call with an affectionate goodnight. She checked her bag one last time, making sure she hadn't forgotten her wallet or apron. She hung the apron on the back hook before stepping out into the night. The rain had grown heavier, tapping steadily on the asphalt. A tow truck idled at the far end of the parking lot, its headlights glowing faintly through the mist. Lena didn't seem to notice. She pulled her hood over her hair and began walking toward the street, her footsteps careful, her pace unhurried. She kept one hand in her pocket, fingers brushing against the small collection of objects she often carried, a smooth river stone and the spare key she kept on a simple chain. Somewhere along the quiet stretch of Highway 6, in the space between the last diner light and the slow turn into the residential road, she disappeared from the town's routine. It happened quietly, without a shout, without a sign, without anything more than the echo of rain on pavement. By the next morning, she had not returned home, and Raven's wake would never be the same again. The night Lena Marlowe disappeared, the rain did not fall evenly. It came in uneven sheets that swept across the valley, breaking against rooftops and the curved hoods of parked cars, then retreating into mist before returning again. The kind of storm that felt indecisive, restless, and cold enough to make every traveler along Highway 6 quicken their pace. The street lamps buzzed faintly, halos of white hovering in the thick air, struggling to push back against the fog crawling across the asphalt. At 10:14 p.m., according to the diner's clock, Lena stepped outside and waited under the awning. Her co-worker later remembered the way she pulled her hood tight and turned her face slightly away from the rain, as if bracing herself for a familiar discomfort. The parking lot lay half empty, a few sedans and pickup trucks scattered beneath dim lights. A tow truck idled near the edge of the lot, its engine a low rumble beneath the rain. It belonged to the local roadside service, white cab, orange stripe, the same truck many in town had flagged down for help over the years. At 10:16, Lena began walking toward Highway 6. She stayed close to the puddles where the street lamps reflected the faintest shimmer of amber light. Her route home would normally take 15 minutes. She had walked it countless times after late shifts, always alert, but never visibly fearful. She carried her bag over one shoulder, and inside it were the usual items: wallet, notebook, a river stone she'd picked up days earlier, and the spare motel key she tended to hold when she felt uneasy. 2 witnesses saw her pass by the gas station at 10:21 p.m. The cashier recalled her stepping in briefly, shaking off her hood, and buying a pack of gum. She smiled politely, though the cashier later noted she looked tired, something in her eyes distant, as if preoccupied. A trucker filling his tank outside confirmed seeing her cross the station's lot and head down the sidewalk that paralleled the highway. The rain intensified around 10:27. A local couple driving home from a late movie reported seeing a figure walking along the shoulder, jacket hood up, moving slowly. They could not confirm it was Lena, but the timing and direction matched her usual path. After 10:30, the timeline loosened. The rain swallowed everything in rolling sheets that made distance and movement difficult to read. The fog thickened, drifting upward from the Alder River and sliding across the road in pale curtains that blurred the boundary between pavement and shoulder. What investigators pieced together came from small fragments of witness accounts. A neighbor living near the bend of the highway claimed he heard the sound of a truck door shutting sometime around 10:38, followed by an engine revving briefly. He looked outside but saw only headlights diffused into indistinct shapes. The storm muted everything. The details, he admitted, were unclear. No one could say for certain when Lena left the sidewalk or why. She may have stepped aside to avoid a deep puddle. She may have paused to fix her hood. She may have approached the vehicle she recognized. Or it may have pulled alongside her, offering help in the worsening rain. What happened in those minutes remained unknown. At 11:05 p.m., a passing motorist noticed something on the ground near a narrow access road branching from the highway. He described it as a dark shape lying close to the ditch, but when he slowed, the rain obscured his view and he continued driving. He assumed it was debris washed down from the logging road. At 11:23, a tow truck similar in appearance to the one at the diner was seen entering the old logging spur near the Alder River. The truck's movement was not unusual. Drivers often checked for stranded vehicles or cleared fallen branches after storms. But the report later gained significance because the log showed no official service request at that hour. What happened next remained hidden from view until dawn. The storm weakened slightly around 5:40 a.m. when the sky turned a pale, indistinct gray. Mist clung to the treetops, settling along the riverbanks. A volunteer searcher named Jonah Miles, who often walked the trails near the water before his shift at the mill, noticed fresh tire tracks leading from the logging road to a clearing less than 100 yards from the river. They cut deep into the wet soil, curving abruptly as if the driver had turned around quickly. Jonah followed the tracks out of curiosity, stepping over broken branches and flattened grass. He later described feeling an odd heaviness in the air, something he could not articulate. It was not fear, he said, but a sense that the clearing held a secret waiting just beneath the surface. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a clump of saturated ferns, he saw the first sign, a pale object lying atop the mud. It was a shoe, soaked through, its laces splayed. A few feet away, he found a notebook with softened pages stuck together by rainwater. He recognized it as the type Lena carried to work, though he did not open it then. The ground nearby appeared disturbed, soil displaced in irregular patterns. A narrow depression marked where something or someone had been dragged or carried a short distance. Jonah stepped back, feeling the cold twist around him. He fumbled for his phone and called the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived within 15 minutes. The clearing felt unnervingly quiet by then, the kind of silence that forms after a storm when the world seems to hold itself still. They followed the trail of disturbed soil into a thicket of alder saplings. There, among low branches heavy with rainwater, they found Lena. Her body lay partially concealed by leaves and brush, as though the storm had tried to cover her. The rain had washed away many traces, but small details remained. Her jacket was missing, her bag was gone. One hand rested near her chest, the fingers curled inward, coated with a thin layer of mud. The ground beneath her was soft, shaped by the weight of her fall. Close to her left shoulder, embedded in the mud, lay a small plastic object. It was a motel key tag, faded yellow. The number 12 stamped in worn black. The deputies marked the area and waited for backup. A forensic photographer was called to capture every angle before the weather changed again. The clearing filled slowly with investigators moving carefully, speaking quietly, aware of how fragile the scene had become. The discovery of the key puzzled them immediately. The Alder Motor Lodge was 3 miles from the site. There was no reason for a motel key to be here, much less one that looked identical to the duplicate Lena kept at home. But the tag at the scene was not cracked like her spare. It was intact, newer, cleaner in the center, though mud clung to its edges. A set of partial tire impressions, deep but incomplete, marked the access road. The spacing and tread pattern resembled those made by a medium-duty tow truck, the kind commonly used around Raven's Wake, but the impressions lacked clarity, and the rain had already started to distort the edges. Deputies canvassed the area and found another clue further down the trail. A cigarette butt lodged between 2 rocks, the paper soggy but slightly protected by the overhang of branches. They collected it, unsure whether it was related, hoping it would hold something useful. As investigators examined the clearing, they noted an odd detail. Near the tree line, a disturbed patch of ground revealed a glint of metal. Scraping away the top layer of soil exposed a parking ticket stub, waterlogged but legible enough to reveal the logo of the Alder Motor Lodge. The time stamp matched the previous evening's late hours. It was unclear how the stub had ended up so far from the motel. The sheriff's notes later described this as anomalous placement. Whether it belonged to the suspect or had been accidentally dropped during the storm remained uncertain. When word spread through Raven's Wake, the town reeled. People had feared the worst when Lena didn't return home, but the reality still struck harder than expected. Volunteers formed search lines along the riverbank, hoping to find her missing bag or any sign of what had happened. The key tag quickly became the focal point of speculation. Whispers filled the streets, the diner, the mill's break room. How many room 12 keys existed? Who might have had access to one? Was it connected to the strange presence of the tow truck earlier that night? Investigators combed through motel records, questioned staff, and compared timestamps. They discovered that room 12 had not been officially rented that week. But the motel owner had noted an odd discrepancy. One of the spare keys had gone missing earlier in the month, replaced by a freshly cut duplicate. He couldn't remember who had asked for it, only that it seemed routine at the time. Despite the mounting clues, the case did not form a clear picture. The storm had erased footprints and diluted biological evidence. The cigarette butt yielded inconclusive initial results. The parking ticket stub offered direction but not certainty. And the key tag so central, so incriminating, provided no fingerprints, no viable trace, nothing that science at the time could use. The only definitive truth was that Lena had been taken somewhere between the diner and her apartment, transported to the clearing near the river, and left there before dawn. How, why, and by whom remained shrouded in fog as thick as the one that had moved through the valley that night. When the investigators finally left the clearing, they paused at the edge of the access road. The rain had tapered off into a fine mist, drifting like smoke above the damp soil. One of the deputies looked back and noticed something unusual, a small indentation near the tire track, shaped almost like a partial boot print. It was too shallow to preserve, already dissolving into the mud. An unresolved detail, fading quickly, like the last trace of someone who knew the storm would hide their path. The days after Lena's body was found were a blur of interviews, canvases, and hurried notes. Investigators worked with the urgency that follows any community tragedy, pushing through long shifts and relentless rain. The motel key tag, the cigarette butt, the tire impressions, each held potential. Each was examined with hope that rarely survived the night. But within weeks, the investigation began to fragment into competing theories, none of which withstood scrutiny for long. The first major lead centered on a drifter who had been seen near the gas station that night. He'd passed through Raven's wake before, usually sleeping behind the shuttered feed store or asking for spare change near the mill gates. Someone reported seeing him watching the highway around the time Lena walked by. Deputies brought him in for questioning. He denied everything, confused but cooperative, eyes darting between officers as he insisted he had been drinking alone behind the old warehouse. A search of his belongings turned up nothing but worn clothes and a pocket knife. When asked why he was near the gas station, he simply said he liked the neon glow of the sign on rainy nights. Investigators checked his alibis, compared footprints, tested the knife for residue. Everything came back negative. After 3 days, they released him. The community felt no relief, only a growing ache. In early interviews, motel staff tried to recall who might have requested a replacement key for room 12. The owner remembered a man with a deep voice, though he could not describe his face. He said it happened quickly, someone asking for a spare, claiming a guest had misplaced the original. When asked why he didn't verify the guest's identity, he shrugged. In a small town, he explained, most people seemed familiar. You think you know who's walking in, he said, until you don't. His words lingered in the investigator's notes like a warning no one could properly decode. Weeks passed, and the case absorbed the full weight of the town's grief. Volunteers searched the riverside again and again, hoping to find Lena's missing bag, or any object that could explain the path she had taken that night. They found nothing but driftwood, beer cans, and stones shaped by the river's slow patience. Each empty-handed return carved deeper into the hope that they might uncover something meaningful. Another suspect emerged, a former mill worker with a history of volatile behavior. He had been fired a few months before the murder and was known to frequent the diner where Lena worked. Several employees recalled him watching her with an expression they found unsettling. Deputies brought him in, searching his truck and home. They found a stack of motel brochures, most of them outdated, and a handful of unlabeled keys. For a moment, the mood in the department shifted. People leaned forward. Investigators spoke in hurried tones. Someone whispered, "This might be it." But the keys had no relation to room 12. Most belonged to old storage sheds and a rental trailer he had once lived in. His alibi was weak but verifiable. He had spent the night at his brother's house repairing a leaking bathroom pipe. Both his brother and sister-in-law confirmed the story with frustrating consistency. The cigarette butt from the crime scene did not match. The mill worker was released, leaving the station through the back door to avoid the gathering of anxious residents outside. Months folded into one another. The weather shifted from rain to chilled fog to frost, then back again. Every season pressed its own silence onto the case. Emily Marlowe visited the sheriff's office weekly, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply sitting with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for someone to offer news. Detectives tried to give her updates, but the updates hollowed over time. "We're working on new leads," they said. "We haven't forgotten." She nodded politely, but her eyes told the truth. She was losing faith in all of them.
The media coverage came in waves. Reporters from Seattle arrived, filming the diner, the highway, the logging road, they spoke to townspeople who repeated the same statements of fear and disbelief. For a brief moment, the attention brought new tips, most of them dead ends. A sighting in Tacoma, a man boasting in a bar near Aberdeen, someone claiming to have seen a woman matching Lena's description days after the murder. None of it held. Newspapers eventually moved on. Broadcast vans left town. The story drifted into the background again. Inside the sheriff's office, investigators wrestled with the pieces. The motel key tag continued to confuse them. It was newer than expected, likely a duplicate. But without fingerprints or usable DNA, it was little more than a symbol of something they couldn't see clearly. The parking ticket stub pointed toward someone visiting the motel the night of the murder. Yet the timestamp didn't match any guest check-ins. The cigarette butt yielded partial genetic markers that were too degraded to compare meaningfully. Tire impressions resembled a tow truck, but half the vehicles in Alder County used similar treads, and the possible boot print had vanished entirely with the rain. Detectives debated theories in low voices late into the evenings. One believed the murderer was a stranger passing through. Another argued it had to be someone local, someone who knew the logging road's layout well enough to choose the clearing. Old crime scene photos were spread across tables, annotated in different handwriting styles from investigators who came and went. Some stared at the images with frustration, others with exhaustion. None found clarity. Years began to peel away. By 1990, 2 more disappearances along Highway 6 shook the community. Both victims were young women, both vanished in bad weather, and both left behind only fragments of their routines. A receipt in one case, a scarf in another. The sheriff's office reopened Lena's file and attempted to overlay the timelines. Deputies revisited the motel. They questioned the owner again. They searched the riverbanks until the mud soaked through their boots. Still nothing. Dialogue between officers reflected the growing despair. "We're chasing shadows," one detective said. Another replied, "He's here. He's been here. We're looking right past him." A third murmured, "Or maybe he's nobody we'd ever think to suspect." Families of the missing women gathered in the church basement once a month, sharing quiet conversations that often dissolved into tears. Someone would mention Lena, and the room would fall still. Emily attended a few meetings, but each time she left feeling emptier than before. She kept the spare motel key on a string in her pocket, running her thumb along the cracked plastic whenever voices softened into memories of daughters and sisters who never came home. Investigators pursued lead after lead. A hitchhiker arrested near the coastal highway, a trucker caught leaving a rest stop under strange circumstances, a former convict spotted near the mill at night. Each suspect was interrogated, logged, evaluated, discarded. Files grew heavier, desks cluttered, morale thinned. New deputies inherited old frustrations. They murmured among themselves about a pattern they could sense but not prove. In 1993, a task force was formed, pulling resources from neighboring counties. They held meetings in the conference room, stacking maps on corkboards, drawing red lines between locations, marking dates that formed an unsettling rhythm. They noticed how many sightings involved tow trucks, though none carried enough evidence to pursue a specific driver. They noticed how the logging spurs created concealment opportunities, though the area was too vast to cover fully. They pressed the motel owner again to recall the replacement key's origin, but his memory had deteriorated. "It was just someone from town," he insisted. "I think maybe the task force lasted until 1997. They issued reports, sent evidence to labs, reopened interviews, and chased down distant possibilities. They built a binder of persons of interest, none of whom matched any forensic markers." Over time, funding weakened, staff rotated out. Priorities shifted toward cases with clearer suspects and fresher evidence. By the time the task force dissolved, the case had settled into the kind of weary stalemate investigators dreaded. The motel key remained in its evidence bag, preserved but silent. The parking ticket stub was sealed away in another folder. The cigarette butt, degraded but kept in hope, retained its place in the freezer. The maps on the corkboards were taken down, stacked, and filed away, and a short note entered into the record summarized the mood all too plainly. "Insufficient evidence for prosecutorial advance. Recommend retention as cold case." On the night the file was officially moved into long-term storage, the sheriff at the time walked down the hallway carrying the box himself. He had no audience, no formal ceremony, just a quiet moment in a dim corridor surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights. He paused before placing the box on the shelf. For a moment, he seemed reluctant to let it go. Perhaps he feared that shelving the file meant abandoning Lena, letting her story fade into the backlog of unresolved tragedies. He whispered something only he heard, then slid the box into place. The latch clicked shut with a dull finality, echoing faintly in the room. And the file, once the center of frantic investigation, became another folder waiting for a future no one could predict.
In the years after the investigation stalled, time moved differently for the Marlowe family. For most residents of Raven's Wake, the memory of Lena's disappearance slowly softened into something spoken of only on rainy anniversaries or in brief moments of reflection. But for Emily, those years stretched, tightened, and curled inward around the same questions she had asked since she was 17. The town changed. She did not. Every shift in her life seemed to revolve around the same empty chair at the kitchen table, the same untouched belongings in the drawer, the same motel key she kept pressed between her fingers on nights when sleep refused to come. Her mother drifted back into town briefly in 1990, settling into a rented room above the laundromat. She claimed she wanted to help, but her grief was unstable and often turned into anger at whoever stood closest. Emily tried to rebuild something with her, but conversations soon dissolved into tension. Their mother couldn't bear the reminders of what she'd left behind. By the end of that year, she packed her things into a borrowed car and drove south. Emily watched from the window, not expecting to see her again. The absence felt familiar, though this time it layered itself upon a loss that refused to loosen. Emily grew older. She graduated from high school wearing borrowed shoes and a dress she found secondhand. In every photo taken that day, she held a small smile that did not reach her eyes. At the ceremony, her classmates celebrated and embraced their families. Emily found herself drifting toward the edge of the crowd, quietly touching the motel key she wore on a thin chain under her dress. She imagined her sister beside her, teasing her about her stiff posture or the way she clung to the gift bags instead of opening them. Grief often arrived for Emily in small, ordinary shapes like this, moments that should have been simple but were shadowed by the one person missing. As the decade wore on, the town shifted. The mill introduced new machinery, reducing shifts and cutting back on labor. The diner underwent a minor renovation, replacing the old booths with newer ones that never quite matched the original charm. New families moved into Raven's wake, unaware of the history woven into its fog-drenched streets. People stopped mentioning Lena unless prompted. When they spoke of her, they described the case in softened terms. "That girl from years back," they said. A terrible thing. Emily hated how her sister's name sometimes drifted out of those sentences entirely, replaced by a vague, worn phrase. Around the same time, investigators changed hands. Deputies retired or transferred to other departments. Case files shifted from one desk to another, gaining new notations but no breakthroughs. The motel closed for a few months, reopened under new ownership, then struggled through a handful of seasons before shuttering entirely. Its sign darkened. Rain beat down on the peeling paint. The building seemed to sag under the weight of too many lost stories. Emily often walked by it on her way home from work. She would pause at the entrance, staring at the boarded windows. For reasons she never articulated, she always reached into her pocket and touched the cracked motel key. It was the only object that still tied her to the memory of Lena in a way that felt real and tangible. She wondered if the original key, the one found near Lena's body, still sat locked inside an evidence room, aging as quietly as she was. As time passed, new tragedies entered the headlines. People outside Raven's wake forgot about Lena. News anchors mentioned old cold cases in passing, listing them in segments about unsolved crimes. But Lena's name rarely appeared. The parking ticket stub, the cigarette butt, the indistinct boot print, all of it faded beneath layers of dust and paperwork. Emily left town briefly for community college in Olympia. She lasted 2 semesters before returning home, overwhelmed by the pace of the city and the way people asked polite questions about her family. She didn't want to tell them the truth. She didn't want to see their eyes cloud with pity. Back in Raven's wake, she worked part-time jobs, mostly in retail or clerical positions, anything that kept her mind occupied for long stretches. She developed a habit of writing letters she never intended to send, letters addressed to Lena, full of everyday details about groceries, rent, and the minor victories that felt hollow without her. She kept the letters in a shoebox under her bed. Some were short, just a few sentences. Others filled several pages. She wrote them so she wouldn't forget how to speak to her sister, even if no one else ever heard the words. By the early 2000s, the sheriff's office had shifted focus away from older cases. The new administration emphasized updated training, modern patrol strategies, and community outreach, but the cold case room remained untouched. Files collected dust, cardboard boxes sagged at the corners, and the hum of the fluorescent lights became a kind of soundtrack to neglect. The motel key sat in its evidence bag, unexamined for years. One afternoon in 2005, a young journalist from a regional paper stopped by the Marlowe home. She wanted to write about unsolved cases in rural Washington. Emily answered the door, hesitant but willing to listen. They sat at the kitchen table, and the journalist took notes while Emily recounted the events of that stormy night, the years of waiting, the fading of hope. When the article was published, it was short, just a few paragraphs buried near the back of the paper. But Emily clipped it out and pinned it to her corkboard. Beneath the grainy headline, Lena's name appeared in bold type. It felt like a small acknowledgement, a momentary return of recognition. The article circulated quietly online. A few people emailed the sheriff's office with tips, most of them misguided or irrelevant. Still, for a brief moment, the case stirred again, gently, like a ripple across still water. It subsided just as quickly. As the years rolled on, aging carved new shapes into the Marlowe home. Photographs faded, their edges curling inward. The Riverstone collection Lena kept became dusty, its colors duller than before. The small jar sat untouched on Emily's shelf, a reminder of days when collecting stones and glass shards felt like a kind of treasure hunt. She never opened the jar again, afraid the memories inside might feel smaller than she wanted them to be. Time, however, did not erase everything. In 2013, technology once again leaped forward. News stories began highlighting developments in forensic analysis as touch DNA, genetic genealogy, the ability to extract biological material from items long believed too degraded to test. Emily read these articles with cautious skepticism. She knew better than to let hope rise too quickly. But somewhere deep inside, something shifted the way it had the night she held her graduation cap in her hands, whispering a wish she didn't fully understand. The following year, a new detective transferred into Alder County's sheriff's office. She walked the hallways with a calm, observant presence and asked pointed questions during briefings. Her name was Mara Leland. Although Emily didn't know it yet, Mara had grown up not far from Raven's Wake and remembered the stories about the disappearances from her own childhood. When she passed the cold case room one morning, she paused and pushed the door open. Dust motes drifted through the air. Boxes leaned precariously on metal shelves. She scanned the labels until one caught her eye. Marlowe, Lena -1987. She pulled the box down. In that small moment, the lost years began to bend towards something new. Not yet hope. Hope was too fragile a word. But possibility, quiet and persistent. Emily felt it before she knew why. That night, she wrote another letter to her sister, longer than any she'd written in years. She folded it gently and placed it in the shoebox with the others. Then she took the motel key from her pocket and held it tightly, not knowing that the very object she clung to was mirrored by another key sealed away, waiting for science that had finally caught up. She slept with the key in her hand, unaware that in another building across town, a detective had opened a file that had rested untouched for more than a decade. And somewhere in that overlap of old grief and new technology, the story began to turn again. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. For most of her career, Detective Mara Leland believed every cold case carried a moment of quiet gravity, an instant when the years of silence began to unwind. She never knew when or where the moment would arrive, only that it would not announce itself with fanfare. It would come softly, the way fog settles on the Alder River at dawn, or how a key turns in a lock you'd forgotten was still functional. On a gray morning in February of 2021, she found herself sitting at her desk with the Marlowe case file open before her. The papers felt brittle, their edges lined with faint brown where time had pressed itself into the fibers. The motel key tag rested in its sealed evidence bag on the corner of her desk, catching the pale overhead light in a muted reflection. She had looked at the key for weeks, studying its scratches and the uneven number stamped onto the surface. She sensed something about it, something that had remained hidden, not because it was subtle, but because the world was not yet ready to understand the story it carried. She requested permission to send the key to the regional forensic lab for advanced testing. When she wrote the submission form, her handwriting was steady but firm. She had no guarantee the lab would find anything. But advances in touch DNA had changed what was possible. Technology that once required large biological samples could now extract meaningful data from microscopic traces. The key, after so many years, might still hold the fingerprints of truth trapped within its grooves. When the lab accepted the evidence, Mara felt a weight lift, not hope, not yet, but a shift in the air, as if the town's long-held breath had finally begun to ease. The key arrived at the laboratory 2 days later, delivered in a temperature-stabilized container lined with absorbent pads to protect it from condensation. Forensic scientist Dr. Rena Halvorson oversaw its intake. She lifted the evidence bag into the sterile hood, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision. The key's yellow surface looked dull beneath the lab's bright illumination, but the grooves along its edge still bore the faint residue of its long journey through storms, searches, and storage. Dr. Halvorson began by documenting every angle with high-resolution photographs. She positioned the tag beneath an alternate light source, adjusting wavelengths until faint outlines shimmered across the plastic. There were patches of fluorescence that suggested the presence of degraded biological material. In the past, these smudges would have been dismissed as unusable. But technology had evolved, and so had the patience of the people who studied it. Using a microswab moistened with buffer solution, she gently pressed along the lower ridge of the tag, where a thumb would naturally land when holding it. She moved slowly, careful not to disrupt the remaining residue. The swab was placed into a sterile vial and transferred to the extraction unit. From there, the process shifted to the machine's quiet instruments capable of parsing out fragments of DNA that would otherwise remain indistinguishable. Hours passed. The extraction ran through its cycles. Machines hummed with steady rhythm. A sequencing display flickered on the monitor, gradually revealing a series of peaks and valleys, initial indicators of genetic material emerging from decades-old silence. The profile was partial, scattered, but viable enough to submit for genealogical tracing. The lab's genetic genealogy specialist, a patient man named Thomas Wexler, received the digital file and uploaded it into an encrypted database. Within the hour, the system began mapping distant familial connections, drawing lines between shared segments and identifying potential relatives several generations removed. Wexler leaned forward as the data cascaded across his screen, forming branches that narrowed into recognizable patterns. A surname caught his attention. Holt. It appeared in several nodes, clustered closely enough to suggest a first-degree or second-degree connection to the source of the DNA. He checked the geographical overlay. Most of the linked relatives lived in or near Alder County. He clicked on the profile of a man named Calder Holt, noting his date of birth, his employment history, and the fact that he had lived in Raven's Wake his entire life. Wexler did not know the details of the Marlowe case, but he flagged the match and forwarded his report to the sheriff's office with a note: potential high-likelihood familial link. When Mara received the lab's email that afternoon, she read it 3 times before moving. She closed her office door, sat down, and placed both hands on her knees, grounding herself. Each line she reread tightened a realization. The motel key tag had carried the DNA of someone related to Calder Holt, the tow truck driver, the man who had assisted in the searches, the man who had approached the task force decades earlier offering ideas about where to look. She opened Lena's file again, flipping through the old statements until she found the one with Holt's name. He had been interviewed briefly when the case first broke. He had claimed he knew nothing, that he simply wanted to help. At the time, his alibi had seemed plausible. His vehicle had not been searched thoroughly. His clothing had not been tested. His presence around the community had been overlooked as harmless. Now, the evidence told a different story. But DNA alone wasn't enough. She needed something more concrete. Mara requested Holt's old tow truck mileage records, which had been archived by the company after he retired. When the dusty folder arrived, she sifted through pages marked with dates and handwritten notes. She traced the entries back to the night Lena disappeared. One line stood out, an unexplained mileage spike that indicated he had driven out toward the logging spur near the Alder River, the same access road where Lena's body had been found. It was the push she needed. She requested confirmation from the parking enforcement office in town. An older clerk, surprised by the inquiry, dug through boxes in the storage room until he found photocopies of parking logs from 1987. The entry matched the timestamp on the ticket stub recovered from the crime scene. The clerk confirmed it belonged to a vehicle registered under the roadside service company Holt worked for. The lodge's duplicate key request suddenly took on new meaning. The motel owner's vague recollection, just a man from town, no longer felt ambiguous. It felt definitive. The truth spread through the evidence with slow, deliberate clarity. A pattern emerged. Holt had been near the diner that night. His truck matched the tire impressions. His DNA matched the touch residue on the key tag. His parking record placed him at the motel. His mileage logs carried him to the river, clearing at the hour Lena vanished. Science had offered the final stitch in a story that had frayed for 36 years. Mara prepared the warrant, her signature precise and heavy with purpose. Deputies followed protocol, verifying each piece of evidence, aligning each thread. They approached Holt's home at dawn the next morning. Illuminated by the soft gray light that crept across Raven's Wake, Holt stepped outside when he saw the patrol cars, his expression calm, almost resigned. He said nothing when they placed him in handcuffs. He looked at the ground as they read him his rights. Word spread quickly across town. People gathered in small groups outside the diner, the grocery store, the mill. The news passed through whispered phrases. They found something. It's about Lena. They arrested him. Faces showed a mixture of relief and horror. Men who had worked alongside Holt shook their heads in disbelief. Women who remembered him from search parties felt sickened by the memory of standing beside him while hoping for answers he had already buried. Emily received the call from the sheriff's office at noon. She listened quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the motel key she still wore into her palm. The voice on the phone explained the DNA match, the genealogical link, the parking record, the old mileage logs. Emily barely heard the details. She closed her eyes and let the silence fill the lingering ache that had lived inside her for decades. She whispered her sister's name, letting it drift across the room like something released after being held too long. That evening, she walked to the Alder River, standing at the edge of the clearing where Lena had been found all those years ago. The ground had changed, softened by time, the saplings grown taller. She held the motel key in her hand, its cracked surface warm from her touch. For a moment she felt Lena beside her, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a presence that had waited patiently for the truth to find its way through fog, through storms, and through all the years of unanswered questions. Science had done what the town could not. It had spoken for Lena. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning they arrested Calder Holt, Raven's Wake felt strangely quiet. The sky hung low with a flat layer of winter clouds, the kind that swallowed sound and softened the outlines of the houses along Cedar Lane. Deputies approached Holt's modest home without sirens, stepping over puddles that reflected the pale light. When they reached the porch, Holt was already standing in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame as if he had expected them. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why they were there. He looked past the officers toward the street, where the tow truck he had driven for decades sat rusting slightly from years of rain. When they told him he was under arrest for the murder of Lena Marlowe, he nodded once slowly, almost imperceptibly, and turned his wrists outward for the cuffs. The steel clicked shut, and for a moment, the world seemed to settle around the gesture. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. Some whispered his name with disbelief. Others stared silently, their memories flickering back to the search parties he had joined, the advice he had given, the steady presence he had offered while pretending to care. The betrayal hung in the air like fog over the river. At the station, Holt sat in the interview room with a stillness that unsettled even the most experienced detectives. Mara Leland entered with the file in her hand, setting it on the table with a soft thud. The evidence inside spanned 36 years, from handwritten notes to high-resolution genetic reports. Holt watched her but said nothing. She began with the motel key tag. She described the touch DNA results, the genealogical match, the parking stub, the mileage records, the old inconsistencies in his statements. Holt listened, expression unchanged. When she mentioned the key's discovery near Lena's body, he looked briefly at the tabletop, as though remembering the texture of mud beneath his boots. His silence felt heavier than any confession. At last, Mara asked him directly, "Did you take her that night?" Holt exhaled, not quite a sigh. "People forget things," he said. His voice was even, almost gentle. "But some things stay with you, even when you don't want them to." It was not an admission, not fully, but it opened a door he had kept locked for decades. The prosecution built the case with deliberate care. They presented the DNA evidence first, allowing the jury to hear how modern science could reach back into the past and draw clarity from fragments of skin cells invisible to the eye. Then came the parking record, authenticated by the clerk who had forgotten it existed until Mara asked. The mileage logs added weight, tracing Holt's path through the valley the night Lena disappeared. Witnesses testified about Holt's presence at the diner earlier that evening, the tow truck spotted near the highway, the memories of his unusual eagerness during the search efforts. None of it alone was definitive. Together, it formed a quiet, undeniable narrative. The trial drew spectators from across the county. The courtroom filled each day with families who remembered the disappearances from their youth, with officers who once patrolled the roads in the hope of preventing another tragedy, with former mill workers who had shared break rooms and lunch hours with Holt. The atmosphere was solemn. People spoke in hushed tones, as if the old walls themselves carried memories of the storm that had changed the town so long ago. Emily attended every session. She sat in the second row, her hands folded in her lap, the cracked motel key hanging from a chain beneath her sweater. She rarely looked at Holt, choosing instead to focus on the attorneys, the exhibits, the projected images of evidence she had lived with in her mind for most of her life. When her sister's notebook was shown to the jury, water-stained and curled at the edges, Emily's breath caught briefly, but she remained still. At one point during the proceedings, the prosecutor introduced the photograph of the crime scene where the key had been found in the mud. The jury studied the image in silence. The key, small and unassuming, lay half buried near the brush. Emily felt something shift inside her, a realization that the object she had carried all her life had always been more than a keepsake. It was a link between what she remembered and what had truly happened. Holt did not testify. His attorney spoke on his behalf, suggesting contamination, coincidence, and the unreliability of old records. But each argument faded against the steady momentum of the evidence. The town's familiarity with Holt no longer offered comfort. It created discomfort, a collective reckoning with how thoroughly he had blended into their routines. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom felt charged, as if every breath awaited release. The jury filed in, their expressions composed but somber. The foreperson stood and announced the verdict: guilty on multiple counts of murder. A brief silence followed, deep, resonant, almost sacred. Then Emily bowed her head, her fingers tightening around the motel key beneath her sweater. Her grief did not lessen in that moment, but it found shape, as though the years of uncertainty had formed a boundary she could finally step beyond. Mara watched from the back of the room. She had stood in many courtrooms before, but this verdict felt different. It felt like stitching together a wound that had grown with the town itself. She left the courthouse quietly, stepping into the cold air with the sense that the fog hanging over Raven's wake was beginning to lift, even if only slightly. After the trial, the sheriff's office held a small meeting to acknowledge the work done on the case. Older deputies attended, some carrying memories of sleepless nights during the original investigation. They spoke quietly among themselves, reflecting on what they could have seen, what they missed, what they misinterpreted. Mara thanked them. She knew their regrets ran deep, but she also knew this closure belonged to the town as much as to the department. As for the community, reactions unfolded gently over the following weeks. People talked in soft tones in grocery aisles and leaned against fences during breaks at the mill. Some expressed shock that Holt had lived so comfortably among them. Others said they had always sensed something uneasy in his presence, but never knew how to articulate it. Little by little, the conversations shifted from disbelief to relief, each person reassessing memories through the lens of the verdict. Emily visited the Alder River one more time before winter loosened. She walked along the narrow trail, the ground dark and soft beneath her boots. When she reached the clearing, she stood in the silence that stretched out before her. The trees had grown taller, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the pale sunlight into scattered patches on the ground. She held the motel key in her hand, brushing her thumb over its cracked edge. For the first time, the object felt lighter, not because it had changed, but because its burden had. She whispered Lena's name into the quiet air around her. The breeze shifted, rustling the leaves in a slow, steady motion that felt almost like acknowledgement. Closure did not erase pain, but it gave shape to the years that had blurred together. It offered the possibility of peace, even if fragile. And as Emily walked back toward town, she felt the faintest sense of release, as though the weight she had carried since her teenage years had finally begun to lift. Justice had taken decades to arrive in Raven's wake, but when it did, it settled deeply, changing the town's rhythm in ways subtle and enduring. People carried themselves differently, spoke of Lena with a tenderness untouched by time, and allowed themselves to believe that even in quiet, rain-soaked places, truth could surface. In the months after the verdict, Raven's wake settled into a quieter rhythm. Not the uneasy hush that had lingered for decades, but something steadier, gentler, as though the town was finally learning how to exhale again. The diner repaired its cracked windows, repainting the trim in a brighter shade of red. The mill adjusted its shifts and rehired workers who had left during the years of uncertainty. People greeted each other with small nods that carried a kind of mutual understanding. They had all endured something together, and now they were rebuilding in the shadow of what they finally knew. Emily found herself noticing the town in ways she hadn't since she was young. She walked the same roads Lena once took home from work, tracing the familiar curve of Highway 6 where street lamps reflected softly off the pavement. For years, she had avoided these places, unable to look directly at the path her sister had walked on the last night of her life. Now she followed it intentionally, not to relive the loss, but to reclaim it, piece by piece. She kept the cracked motel key in a small wooden box on her nightstand. It no longer traveled with her everywhere. She no longer pressed it into her palm to steady her breath. Instead, she opened the box whenever she wanted to remember her sister in a way that felt whole rather than tragic. The key had once been an anchor to grief. Now it felt like a marker of survival, a reminder that even small objects could outlast storms and silence. Detective Mara Leland returned to her regular caseload, but something in her had shifted as well. She walked past the cold case room every morning, aware that its shelves still held countless stories trapped in dust and files. The Marlowe case had taught her that persistence mattered, that breakthroughs sometimes arrived decades late, but carried the same weight as if they were found the next day. She kept a photo of the motel key's lab report clipped inside her notebook, not for pride, but as a reminder that science could speak for those who no longer could. The townspeople, too, carried the lessons in quiet ways. Search volunteers who had once combed the riverbanks with Holt among them spoke softly about how easily darkness could hide behind routine familiarity. Parents who had grown up with Lena's story taught their children to walk in groups when the weather turned harsh. And on certain cloudy evenings, when the fog curled in from the river, more than one resident said they felt a moment of stillness, something like respect for all that had been carried, lost, and finally understood. The clearing near the Alder River gradually reclaimed itself. Spring rains coaxed tall grasses back into the soil, softening the sharp edges of the place where Lena had been found. Emily visited once more near the anniversary, pausing at the tree line as the sun slipped behind the mist. She didn't need to stand at the center of the clearing anymore. Instead, she lingered beneath the branches, listening to the hush of the water moving slowly through the valley. She let the air settle around her, warm and cool at the same time, the way it often was an early evening. She whispered a thank you, not to the river, not to the sky, but to the years themselves for carrying her this far. When she turned to walk back toward town, the last light reflected off the wooden box she held in her hand. Inside it, the motel key rested quietly, no longer sharp with sorrow, but softened by time and truth. It seemed almost to glow in the fading daylight, as if the metal remembered what it had endured and what it had finally helped reveal. Justice had arrived slowly, but it had arrived. And in the space it left behind, something like peace began to take root. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.